The camera opens on a quiet Midwestern town, the kind where people leave their doors unlocked and know the faces of every neighbor. The sky is a muted gray, the air still. You can almost hear the silence. But beneath that calm exterior lies a story so haunting, so chilling, that it would rip the innocence from this community forever. Before we begin, if you're new here, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to hear is a case that defies reason, divides opinion, and forces us to ask the most uncomfortable of questions. What do we really know about the people we think we can trust? And can justice ever be certain? This is not just another true crime story. This is Delphi, Indiana, February 13th, 2017. A date now burned into the memory of an entire town. On that day, two best friends, Abby Williams and Libby German, set out for what should have been an ordinary walk on the Monon High Bridge Trail. It was a rare February afternoon that felt like spring, the kind that tricks you into believing the cold has loosened its grip. School was out, the air was crisp, and the girls were free. But the photographs they took that day would be their last. The girls never came home. Hours later, their families were calling their phones, sending texts, feeling that creeping unease that starts as a whisper, but quickly grows into something you can't ignore. When Libby's phone rang without answer, that whisper became a siren. And the only clue, a haunting image of Abby standing on the rusted beams of the high bridge, captured by Libby's phone, and the faint, blurred figure of a man approaching from behind. By nightfall, a search was underway. The community poured into the woods, flashlights cutting through the winter dusk, voices calling into the cold air. The next day, near Deer Creek, the search ended in the most devastating way possible. Abby and Libby were found. The brutality of the crime stunned even seasoned investigators. Libby had been stripped, her body bearing signs she had fought for her life. Abby's throat had been cut. In a place where crime usually meant a stolen bike or a broken window, a killer was now loose. But the horror didn't stop with the murders. It grew in the shadows that followed. Who was the man on the bridge? Why had Libby been filming? And why did it take years, not days, to name a suspect? At first, it seemed like the case would be solved quickly. After all, Libby's phone had captured not just the man's image, but his voice. 3 words that would send chills down the spine of everyone who heard them. Guys, down the hill. Yet the grainy footage was incomplete. Only fragments were released to the public, leaving more questions than answers. For years, the investigation seemed to stall. The identity of Bridge Guy became the subject of fevered speculation. Could it be a neighbor, a co-worker, someone who had walked unnoticed through the lives of Delphi's citizens for years? And then, in October 2022, everything changed. The name was Richard Allen. A local man, a husband, a father, not an outsider, not a stranger passing through. Someone who lived in the very same community, who worked at the local CVS, whose face was familiar to many. His arrest shattered the fragile sense of security that Delphi had been clinging to. And yet, almost immediately, a new fracture emerged. Because while prosecutors painted him as a cold-blooded killer, his wife, Kathy Allen, stood before the world and said, "No, you've got the wrong man." Kathy described him as a family man. She recounted how, on the very day of the murders, he had told her he was out on the trail, had even reported that fact to police himself. Years went by without incident, until a forgotten report, misfiled by a volunteer clerk, suddenly thrust Richard Allen's name back into the spotlight. Investigators came to their door. Soon after, they claimed they had found the smoking gun, literally. According to police, a single unspent .40 caliber round had been discovered near one of the girls' bodies. Forensic testing, they said, matched that round to Allen's Sig Sauer pistol. It was a detail that sounded damning until you heard Richard's reaction. Confused, stunned, insisting there was no way a bullet from his gun could have been there. But the state's case didn't end there. In recorded jailhouse calls, Allen could be heard telling his wife and mother that he had done it, that he had killed Abby and Libby. Each time they pushed back, telling him he was wrong, that something was being done to him in prison, that his medication was off, that he wasn't thinking clearly. And yet, the confessions kept coming. This is where the story darkens further. Allen's defense attorneys say he was being held in a maximum security prison instead of a county jail, in solitary confinement under the watch of guards who were openly wearing Odinist patches, a reference to a white supremacist pagan group that some believe could be connected to the murders. The defense's claim? That the crime scene itself showed signs of ritualistic killing, and that investigators ignored this theory to focus on Allen instead. And when you pull at that thread, the picture becomes even stranger. Key witness descriptions. like a sighting of a man with brown, poofy hair in his 20s or a car completely unlike Allen's, were allegedly left out of the probable cause affidavit that secured the search of his home. Why? Was it an oversight or a deliberate narrowing of the case to fit a suspect? Richard Allen's lawyers argue that what the public saw was only part of the story, and that the real story is one of tunnel vision, secrecy, and withheld evidence. The prosecution, of course, sees it differently. They believe the man on the bridge, the voice on the recording, and the bullet at the crime scene point to one undeniable truth: that Richard Allen is guilty. But in Delphi, nothing is simple. The case has become a battlefield, not just in court, but online, splitting people into two passionate camps. Those convinced Allen is the killer, and those equally convinced he's the victim of a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. And in between, a restless middle, caught between horror at the crime and doubt about the process that followed. The Hulu docuseries pulled the curtain back just enough to inflame those divisions further. It gave Kathy Allen a voice, showed Richard's defense team laying out their alternate theory, and forced viewers to confront the uncomfortable truth that even in the most public of cases, what we think we know is rarely the whole picture. And here's where the tension tightens. Because while the public debates, two families still grieve, still live with the loss of Abby and Libby, still search for meaning in the senseless. Justice, in whatever form it ultimately takes, will not bring them back. Yet as we move deeper into this story, one question hangs in the air like a shadow. Did Delphi's need for closure lead to the wrong man being locked away? Or are the defense's claims just smoke, designed to obscure a truth too horrific to accept? The interrogation room where Richard Allen sat in October 2022 was stark. Fluorescent light, washing everything in a cold, almost clinical hue. The table between him and the investigators was bare except for a folder, the weight of its contents unspoken but crushing. For 5 years, the investigation had circled without landing. Now they were telling him they had the evidence that would end that circle. One of the detectives leaned in, his voice steady but deliberate, each word meant to cut through the silence. "We took your Sig Sauer, Rick, the .40 caliber, sent it to the lab, matched it to a round found at the crime scene, February 14th, the day we found the girls." He opened the folder, slid a photograph across the table. This one, a Winchester 6 inches from Liberty German's foot. The picture showed a spent casing lying in the frozen dirt. Richard stared at it, his brow furrowing. I don't even know how my bullet would have gotten out there, he said, voice cracking. "If that's my bullet, it's not my round." The detective's tone hardened. "The extraction marks are a perfect match to your weapon. This is scientific, Rick, it doesn't lie. But science, as any seasoned investigator or defense lawyer knows, can be wielded like a weapon. And in this case, the defense would later argue that it was being used to close a case quickly, not accurately." Richard repeated his disbelief. "There's no way. I'm telling you, there's not. How did that round get there? I don't know." Then the door opened, and Kathy Allen stepped in. Her voice was softer but edged with fear. "They're saying it came from our gun." She searched her husband's face for an answer, any answer that made sense. "They showed me the picture. One in your box above the dresser matched it." "How, Rick?" "I can't explain it," he said, almost pleading. "I don't know." And yet, less than 2 weeks later, he would sit in a prison phone booth and tell her something entirely different. "I did it," his voice low, almost resigned. "I killed Abby and Libby." Kathy pushed back immediately. "No, you didn't. They're messing with you. You're not well. Something's wrong with your meds." But the calls kept coming and the words kept repeating. "I inevitably did it." Sometimes with hesitation, sometimes with what sounded like conviction, and sometimes so muddled it was as if even he didn't know what he meant. The prosecution would later present these calls as evidence of guilt. The defense countered with a darker picture. A man kept in solitary confinement, not in a county jail but a maximum security prison. Monitored and guarded, they claimed, by men openly displaying Odinist symbols on their uniforms. The defense's filings would describe this as more than intimidation. They claimed the crime scene bore signs of ritual, arrangements of sticks, symbols carved or placed with intent, hallmarks of Odinist or pagan extremist groups. A theory that, if true, could point to entirely different suspects. But the probable cause affidavit, the document that allowed police to search Allen's home, made no mention of that theory. It also omitted certain witness statements that, on their face, seemed significant. Take the sighting by a woman named Betsy Blair. She described a man on the trail the day of the murders, about 20 years old, brown poofy hair. That does not match Richard Allen, a man in his 40s with a stockier build. Blair also described a vehicle parked nearby, a 1965 Mercury Comet, an old boxy classic. Again, not Allen's car. These details never made it into the affidavit shown to the judge. Allen's attorneys called it a case of tunnel vision. The prosecution, for their part, argued that probable cause doesn't require presenting every possible lead, only enough to justify the search. Still, the omissions raised unsettling questions. If evidence that could point away from Allen existed, why not include it? Was it simply a judgment call by investigators, or was the case being steered toward a foregone conclusion? The Hulu docuseries pulled these tensions into the public eye. In one episode, viewers saw the full haunting clip from Libby's phone. The shaky camera moving along the weathered planks of the high bridge, Abby ahead in her sweatshirt and jeans, and then the grainy image of a man walking toward them. His voice when it comes is abrupt, almost casual. "Guys, down the hill." It's just 4 words, but they hit like a hammer. Who else could it be but the man who killed them? Yet here's the catch. Voices can be deceiving. Play the clip for 10 people, and you might hear 10 different opinions on who it sounds like. Even one of Allen's own lawyers admitted it could sound like his client, before adding it could just as easily sound like his brother, his neighbor, or any number of men in town. The trial that followed was anything but straightforward. For the families of Abby and Libby, it was a chance to finally see someone held accountable. For Allen's defense, it was a battle against what they saw as a tide of circumstantial evidence and public opinion. And then there was Kathy Allen, standing in the middle of it all. For decades, she had shared her life with Richard, building a quiet existence in Delphi. Now she was on national television, her marriage and her husband's name dragged through a nightmare she insisted he had no part in. In the series, she looked into the camera and said she wanted true justice for the girls, but not, she emphasized, at the cost of punishing an innocent man. Her words struck at the heart of the case's divisiveness, because Delphi isn't just a crime scene. It's a small town where people know the accused, where guilt and innocence are tangled with personal history, church congregations, and workplace memories. And that's where this story becomes more than evidence and testimony. It becomes about human fault lines, about what happens when grief, fear, and the hunger for resolution collide with the imperfect machinery of justice. Allen's defense attorney, Andy Baldwin, would later say the Hulu series was a rare chance to present their side to the public. He claimed the case's secrecy in its early years had bred conspiracy theories and hardened camps, much like the high-profile Karen Reed case in Massachusetts. But secrecy isn't the only thing fueling division. It's also the nature of the evidence itself, ambiguous enough to interpret in different ways, yet emotionally loaded enough to sway opinion. A blurry image, a few words on tape, a bullet casing, jailhouse calls. Each piece alone is small. Together, they form the spine of the prosecution's case. But whether they tell a complete truth, or just a convenient one, is something that may take years to decide. For now, Richard Allen sits in prison, convicted of 2 of the most horrific murders in Indiana's history, while his lawyers prepare an appeal they believe could overturn everything. His wife still stands by him. The families of Abby and Libby still want closure, and somewhere in the divide between those truths lies the answer. But here's the question that lingers, the one we'll carry into the next chapter. In a case where every side swears they want justice, how do we know when we've truly found it? And if we discover too late that we were wrong, what then? The Odinist theory didn't just appear out of nowhere, it came from the very heart of the defense's case. To the average person, Odinism might sound like something pulled from a medieval textbook or a fantasy novel. In truth, it's a modern revival of ancient Norse pagan beliefs. And while most practitioners are peaceful, there's a violent extremist fringe. White supremacists who adopt the symbols of Odin and Thor as banners of hate. It was into this shadowy world that Richard Allen's lawyers claimed the Delphi murders might reach. According to them, the crime scene itself bore unmistakable hallmarks of a ritualistic killing. The girls were found in a clearing near Deer Creek. Investigators have never publicly released full details, but fragments have slipped through in court filings and defense statements, sticks arranged in deliberate patterns, tree branches placed in a way that seemed too purposeful to be random, certain items of clothing removed, others swapped, Abby wearing Libby's clothes, and most hauntingly, the suggestion that symbols associated with Odinism were present. For most people, the idea was almost too strange to take seriously. 2 8th-grade girls murdered in a small Indiana town, the act tied to an ancient pagan cult. It sounded like something out of a crime thriller. But the defense wasn't relying on speculation alone. They brought in an expert, a woman who trains the FBI and other law enforcement agencies on recognizing ritualistic crime scenes. Under oath, she testified that the Delphi scene was textbook ritualistic. And crucially, The state did not bring in a single expert to dispute her. Still, the Odinist theory barely made a dent in the official narrative. Police and prosecutors dismissed it as a distraction, pointing instead to Richard Allen, the local man caught on Libby's camera, the man whose gun was linked to a casing at the scene, the man who allegedly confessed on recorded phone calls. But the defense claims that the Odinist angle wasn't just ignored, it was buried. That investigators had viable suspects in Odinist circles early on, but chose not to follow those leads. Why? The answer, according to Allen's lawyers, is that once his name surfaced again in 2022, thanks to that long misfiled report, they locked onto him like a target, and everything else became background noise. That background noise, they argue, includes the very people charged with guarding him once he was in custody. Richard Allen was not placed in a county jail like most pretrial defendants. He was sent instead to a maximum security prison, Westville Correctional Facility, where he was kept in solitary confinement. His attorneys say that when they came to see him, he was often shackled, pale, visibly deteriorating. But what stood out most were the guards. Two of them, Allen's lawyers say, wore patches on their uniforms reading "In Odin We Trust," alongside the rune-like symbols associated with Odinism. The message, they believed, was clear: you're in our hands now. On April 3, 2023, something changed. For months, visits with Allen had been unrecorded, private. But on that day, the very day his attorneys say he emotionally broke, guards escorted him down the hallway with an old-school camcorder hoisted on a shoulder, recording his every step. The same guards, the lawyers say, with the Odinist patches. From then on, their visits were different. Instead of sitting in a closed room, they met in a space with a glass wall. The camera aimed directly at Allen's face. He was positioned so that the camera could see his mouth. It felt like intimidation, one attorney said later. Like they were telling him, "We're watching you, keep your story straight." To an outsider, it might sound paranoid. But the defense points to something else. Allen's confessions from prison were not only inconsistent, they were bizarre. He told his wife he killed the girls. He told her he shot them, which is false. He said he killed his grandchildren. Grandchildren he doesn't even have. He said things that made no sense. Claims the defense insists are the ramblings of a man under extreme psychological stress, possibly manipulation. The state's response: prison conditions were for his own safety. The guards' patches, if they existed, were irrelevant. And as for his statements, no one forced him to make them. But in the public arena, these details only deepened the divide. In one corner, those who saw the Odinist theory as a desperate distraction from strong physical evidence. In the other, those who saw it as the key to a cover-up, one that could mean the real killers are still out there. The Hulu series hinted at these tensions, but didn't have the hours to explore them fully. It showed Kathy Allen's pain, her quiet insistence that her husband could never have done this. It showed snippets of the interrogation, the jail calls, the defense's frustration over evidence they believed was being ignored. But the series left more questions than answers. And perhaps that's the most dangerous thing about this case: the vacuum of certainty. When the truth isn't clear, people will fill that space with whatever theory best fits their fears, their experiences, their need for resolution. Meanwhile, Delphi itself has become a place haunted not just by the memory of Abby and Libby, but by the battle over what happened to them. In the cafes, the grocery store aisles, the pews of Sunday church services, people have opinions, and they are not gentle in expressing them. For some, the sight of Richard Allen's face in the courtroom was all they needed to see. For others, every omission in the probable cause affidavit, every unanswered question about the crime scene is a sign of a dangerous rush to judgment. The appeal process is moving forward, but appeals are not quick. Allen's attorneys estimate it could take well over a year just to brief all the issues. And there are many, too many to tackle at once. They will argue the search warrant was improperly obtained. They will argue the confessions were unreliable. They will argue that the jury did not hear crucial evidence pointing to other possible suspects. But appeals are decided not by public opinion, not by documentaries, not even by the emotional weight of a case. They are decided by the cold, careful parsing of law. And in that arena, the most compelling narrative in the world can be dismantled by a single unfavorable ruling. For Kathy Allen, the legal battle is personal in every possible way. She still lives in Delphi, in the shadow of the bridge where the girls were last seen alive. Every trip to the store risks running into someone who believes her husband is a murderer. Every news headline feels like another layer of concrete being poured over the life they once had. And yet she stands by him, a fact that infuriates some and inspires others. She has prayed, she says, for the real killer to be caught. She has prayed for the families of Abby and Libby, And she has prayed for a justice system that she fears may already have lost its way. But here's the thing about prayer. It asks for answers. And in Delphi, the answers only seem to get more tangled. Because as we'll see in the next part, the story doesn't end with the trial. It moves into the shadows, into allegations of witness manipulation, the strange behavior of certain law enforcement officers, and the deep divisions in the town itself. And somewhere in those shadows may lie the truth about what really happened on that bridge. The courthouse in Carroll County stood like it always had. Solid, brick, a symbol of law in a place where people still believed that truth, once revealed, would set things right. But as the trial of Richard Allen began, the air around it felt different. It was heavy, charged. Lines formed early, locals and reporters side by side, all of them waiting for a glimpse into what had become one of the most divisive cases in Indiana's history. Inside, the room was deceptively small for a case of this magnitude. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of bodies and expectation. The families of Abby Williams and Libby German sat close together, their grief as palpable as the quiet determination in their eyes. Across the aisle, Kathy Allen sat alone, clutching her hands, her face a careful mask of composure over an undercurrent of fear. From the very start, the prosecution wasted no time painting their picture. Richard Allen was bridge guy, they said. The man on the grainy clip from Libby's phone, the voice that ordered guys down the hill. They described a man who lured two innocent girls into a deadly trap, who left behind a single piece of ballistic evidence tying him to the scene. The .40 caliber round wasn't just a clue. It was the key, they insisted, proof that the gun in Allen's home was the same gun connected to the crime scene. Every detail was calculated to hit hard. The jury was shown the video, more than the public had seen before. The frame shifted from Abby, walking the bridge, to the blurred shape of a man following. You could hear the creak of the wooden planks, the wind rushing faintly over the microphone, and then in a voice low but unmistakable, "Guys, down the hill." In that moment, the room seemed to tighten. Jurors leaned forward, eyes fixed. On the other side, Allen's defense scribbled notes, their expressions unreadable. When it was their turn, the defense struck a different tone. They didn't just question the evidence. They questioned the entire foundation of the case. They argued that the bullet could have been transferred, mishandled, even planted. That the witnesses who supposedly saw Allen described a man much younger, taller, with different hair. That other viable suspects had been ignored. And they hinted at something darker, that the crime scene bore the marks of a ritual killing, and that investigators had deliberately turned away from that path. The defense walked the jury through the timeline, pointing out gaps, inconsistencies. They showed how Allen himself had voluntarily told police he was on the trail that day. They asked, would a guilty man do that? But the heart of their case wasn't just in the facts, it was in dismantling the confessions. They replayed calls from the prison, highlighting the bizarre contradictions. "I killed my grandchildren," Allen had said in one. He had none. "I shot the girls in the back," he claimed in another. They hadn't been shot. The defense painted these not as admissions of guilt, but as the ramblings of a man isolated, over-medicated, and possibly intimidated by those guarding him. Still, the prosecution countered with force. They argued that the inconsistencies didn't erase the core truth. Allen repeatedly said he killed Abby and Libby. And sometimes they reminded the jury, the simplest explanation is the right one. Throughout it all, Kathy Allen remained a constant presence. When her husband entered each day, shackled and flanked by deputies, her eyes followed him. She had chosen not to testify, a decision she and the defense made after seeing how aggressively the prosecution cross-examined Allen's daughter. In private, she had urged him to go to the police when news of the murders first broke. That, the defense believed, spoke volumes. But it was a moment the jury would never hear from her own lips. The trial moved forward like a slow, inevitable tide. Witness after witness took the stand. Investigators, forensic analysts, locals who had been on the trail that day. The defense fought to insert doubt at every turn. The prosecution reinforced its central points with each piece of testimony. And then came the closing arguments. The prosecution framed the case as one of justice delayed, but not denied. They reminded the jury of the family's loss, of the community's fear, of the courage it took for Libby to pull out her phone and capture her killer. "She left us the truth," the prosecutor said, gesturing toward the screen where the grainy bridge footage had frozen. "Now it's up to you to act on it." The defense took a different approach, warning of the danger of rushing to judgment, of letting the desire for closure overshadow the need for certainty. "If you convict an innocent man," Baldwin told the jury, "the real killer walks free. And that means justice for Abby and Libby is still undone. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room exhaled for the first time in weeks. But for Kathy Allen, the wait was its own kind of torture. Hours stretched into a day, then another. The courthouse clock ticked, each second heavy with possibility. On the afternoon of the verdict, the courtroom was packed. Reporters poised with pens ready, cameras lined the outside steps. The jurors filed in, faces unreadable. The clerk stood, unfolded the paper, and read the words that would shatter Kathy Allen's world. Guilty on both counts of murder. The gasp from the gallery was audible. On one side, tears of relief. On the other, silence. Kathy didn't move for a moment. Then slowly, she bowed her head, her hands trembling in her lap. The judge thanked the jury, dismissed them, and announced Allen's sentence. Life without parole. It was over, or at least that's how it seemed. The families left with the knowledge that someone had been held accountable. The prosecution declared justice served. But in the defense camp, it was not the end. It was the beginning of a new fight. Outside the courthouse, Baldwin spoke briefly to the press. "We respect the jury's decision," he said, "but we strongly disagree with it. This is not over. We will appeal." And so the story that had begun on a bridge in Delphi was now moving into new territory, into the long, grinding world of appeals courts, where victories are rare, but not impossible. The defense would comb through every ruling, every objection, every omission. They believed there were enough cracks in the case to bring the whole thing down. Yet in Delphi, the verdict didn't bring peace, it only deepened the divide. For some, it was the justice they had prayed for. For others, it was proof that the system could make a terrible mistake. And for the families, even in victory, there was no bringing Abby and Libby back. But as we'll see in the final part of this story, the questions aren't going away. Because in a case where every piece of evidence can be interpreted in two opposing ways, the line between truth and belief is razor thin. And sometimes, in the pursuit of justice, those lines blur beyond recognition. Winter had come again to Delphi. The bare trees stood like skeletal witnesses along the Manon High Bridge Trail, their branches clawing at the gray sky. Deer Creek ran dark and slow beneath the rusted steel, the same place where two best friends had once walked into the unknown. Years had passed, but in this town, time didn't wash away the memory, it carved it deeper. For Richard Allen, life now meant a prison cell. No neighbors, no customers stopping by the CVS, no quiet evenings with Kathy. Only the endless days and nights in confinement. The sound of doors clanging shut, the weight of a guilty verdict that his lawyers swore was built on omissions, misinterpretations, and misplaced trust in flawed evidence. For the families of Abby Williams and Libby German, there was at least the knowledge that someone had been held accountable. But grief is not a wound that closes neatly with a court ruling. It stays open, raw, the edges frayed by the what-ifs. What if Libby's phone battery had died? What if the girls had gone somewhere else that day? What if the real killer was still out there? Those thoughts are poison, but they creep in, especially at night. And for Kathy Allen, life had become a strange, lonely war. She still wore her wedding ring. She still kept his photographs where they'd always been. She still prayed, not just for her husband, but for the families of the girls, and for a truth she believed had been buried under the weight of fear and urgency. She had stood in court and watched as the man she knew, the man she'd lived with for decades, was painted as a monster. And she had listened to strangers say she was either blind or complicit. In a small town, that kind of judgment follows you everywhere. Meanwhile, the appeal was taking shape. Ellen's attorneys were building it like a siege, stone by stone, issue by issue. The probable cause affidavit, they argued, was incomplete to the point of being misleading. The confessions, they said, were unreliable, tainted by extreme prison conditions and possible intimidation. The ritualistic crime scene theory, ignored by investigators, was more than just an alternate narrative. It was a path to entirely different suspects. Appeals courts move slowly, and the outcome is never guaranteed. But Baldwin and his team believed they had something rare, a case where the errors weren't just technical but structural. If they could convince a panel of judges, the verdict could be overturned. And then Delphi would have to live through it all again. But here's the truth. Whether Allen wins his appeal or not, this case has already rewritten the story of this town. Delphi is no longer just a dot on the Indiana map. It's a place forever tied to an image. Two girls on a bridge, a man following behind, a voice saying, "Guys, down the hill." That clip has been played on news broadcasts around the world. It's been dissected by online sleuths, slowed down, enhanced, analyzed frame by frame. But for all the attention, the reality is that those few seconds don't give us the ending we need. They only show the moment before everything went wrong. And maybe that's why this case continues to grip people so fiercely. Because in those few seconds lies a universal fear. that life can change forever in the space between one step and the next. There's another fear too, one that haunts both sides of this divide: the fear of being wrong. For the prosecution's supporters, the nightmare scenario is that they let the real killer slip away. For Alan's defenders, it's that the man they believe is innocent will die in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And in Delphi, both fears exist side by side like two ghosts walking the same road. The Hulu docuseries ended without resolution, leaving viewers to decide for themselves. But in real life, resolution isn't something you decide. It's something you earn if you can. For now, Delphi waits. The appeals will be filed, motions will be argued, more documents will be unsealed, each one promising new revelations, each one adding fuel to a fire that has burned for years. In the meantime, the bridge still stands. Some days, hikers cross it. Others avoid it entirely, unable to walk in the footsteps of Abby and Libby. But the air there is different. People say it feels heavier, as if the place remembers. The last words Libby captured on her phone still echo. The man's voice is calm, almost casual. "Guys, down the hill." He might as well have been saying, "This way." But to Abby and Libby, it was the point of no return. And that's where we are now, in a story that has already gone down the hill, into a place where certainty is hard to find and the path forward is anything but clear. If Richard Allen is guilty, then the families have their justice, even if it will never bring back what was lost. If he's innocent, then somewhere out there is a man who walked away from the scene of an unimaginable crime, free to live his life while another takes his punishment. That's the knife's edge Delphi lives on. And maybe that's why, as you listen to the facts, the theories, the voices on those tapes, you should ask yourself one more question. One that's harder than, who did it? Ask yourself, what if the truth isn't something we can prove in court? What if the truth is something that can only be lived with, or not at all? Because long after the headlines fade, after the lawyers have made their last arguments, after the judges have written their decisions, two names will still be carved into the heart of this town. Abby, Libby. Two girls who went for a walk on a rare warm day in February. Two girls who never came home. And that's something no verdict, no appeal, no theory will ever change. So the question remains, did justice come down that hill with them? Or is it still out there, waiting?